We are
more as a
live.
conversation or me presenting?
Hmm?
Do you see this more as a conversation or me presenting?
You presenting, yeah.
We are live.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thanks to all of you for joining us for our third monthly virtual brown bag lunch event this fall. I'm Ken Clark, Director of the Office of Human Rights of Tompkins County. Today's program is sponsored by 3 Tompkins County offices: Human Rights, Public Health, and the Chief Equity and Diversity Officer. Thanks to Dominic Recchio, Tompkins County Communication Director, Samantha Hilson from Public Health, and Deanna Carruthers, Chief Equity and Diversity Officer, for their input and support for this series. Centering racial and other forms of equity in the workplace is a concept that builds upon but extends beyond the diversity and inclusion initiatives of the past 3+ decades. The Government Alliance on Race and Equity, known as GARE, of which Tompkins County is a member, tells us centering racial and other types of equity is about policies and practices that drive outcomes. Its intent is to identify the roots of inequity in order to produce equitable outcomes. Those most affected by practices, policies, and procedures that have been identified as exclusionary must be at the center of the conversation and implementation of their reform or transformation. Centering racial and other types of equity also require an awareness of intersectionality, a term coined by law professor and critical race theory and scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, a 1981 Cornell alumna and Africana Studies major, to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect and overlap. Intersectionality reveals that individuals and groups live their lives in interconnected ways. Black women, for example, confront both sexism and racism. Others are Latinx and disabled, or Asian, gay, and male, or an immigrant and Muslim. Intersectionality also reveals that the subordination and marginalization these groups and individuals experience based on their multiple identities is also overlapping. Intersectionality, as Professor Crenshaw has said, is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. An understanding of intersectionality must be employed in efforts to center equity in the workplace. Otherwise, we will miss the multi-layered ways in which subordination and marginalization operate. Intersectionality enables us to focus more on the outcomes and impacts of practices, policies, and procedures, and less on the assertion that these administrative measures were not intended to exclude. Joining us today are 2 experts whose work is focused on centering equity in the context of both higher education and government. Michelle Duguid, Associate Professor in Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management, was appointed Associate Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Cornell's S.C. Johnson College of Business in July 2020. She has spoken of the importance of collaboration in equity work, and I quote her, "Alliesship means not only I am not a racist or I am not a sexist, but also being active in challenging systems or individuals that may be racist or sexist and consistently reflecting on ours and others' decision-making and behaviors to address unconscious bias." Benjamin Duncan is the Chief Diversity and Equity Officer for Multnomah County, Oregon, where Portland is located, and which has been the site of continued and ongoing racial protest over this year. He brings together equity, work, and intersectionality, referring to this fusion as leading inclusively with race. His county's workforce equity plan is built on the foundational principles of establishing safety, that is to reduce harm and promote health, building trust, being accountable, responsible, and transparent, and creating a sense of belonging, fitting programs and funding to the people, and eliminating barriers and creating opportunity. Michelle is going to lead off because she has to leave for another engagement at 12:30. But if you in the audience have questions for her, please send them in the chat function along with your email address, and she will respond to your inquiries. Michelle, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Do I have sharing capabilities for slides?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, I'm gonna just share just a couple slides. Hold on. Just when you think you've done a million of these things, here we go. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit. That was, I think you got all of my intro out, a little bit about how higher education, we've been thinking about centering racial and other forms of equity. So actually, Ken mentioned that I took this role, I officially started this role in July. And this was a couple of months after the murder of George Floyd. And you can imagine higher education, universities, there have been a proliferation of people in my role. Cornell had this role in place. The Johnson School, the business school had this role in place, but many of my business school colleagues were appointed after the murder of George Floyd. And we're connected through our networks. Most of these roles are held by people who are underrepresented minorities. And so we were reaching out to each other for best practices, what you're doing, because we have these informal networks. And so one of the first things I did was actually convene a group of business school professors who were in my role so that we could meet up, we could talk, we could share best practices, we could figure out what was working, what wasn't, get ideas, and also vet ideas. And that was particularly useful for us. And I think many of us, we could put what we were doing and in terms of combating racism and trying to promote diversity, inclusion, and belonging into, and we can call them different things, into 4 primary buckets. And this is how we've been thinking about it, the wording specifically at the Johnson School, but this is really the buckets that we've been thinking about across universities, I think, which is increasing representation and retention. And often people immediately think students, but also faculty and staff as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. I'm gonna be very mindful of time. Ken didn't know that us professors like taking up way too much time when he invited me. So he's gonna have to keep me on task. The next is culture, community, and belonging. Curriculum and classroom, since that is a big part of what we do, as is research and external impact and engagement. And finally, measurement and accountability. So, like as I mentioned, when we were thinking about representation and retention, our aim is to redouble our efforts to recruit, hire, and retain underrepresented staff and faculty, as well as increase the diversity of our student population. So an example of this, after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we had these town halls, and our students all were communicating to us, which we've heard before, and I think many universities have heard, because there really is a shortage. We want more underrepresented individuals, faculty in front of us in the classroom. This is a problem in business schools, not a lot of underrepresented minorities or women. It reflects a whole lot of how organizations are in the quote unquote real world. And we are really trying our best to address this issue. One of the things that comes up often is pipeline. And one of the things that we are thinking about doing is pre-docs. Now, when I was at Howard University, people ask me all the time, how did you become, I'm first generation, I'm a minority, all these things. How did you become a business school professor, right? And when I was at Howard, I was shuttled into a program pretty early on when I was in my sophomore year, which got me involved in research, which I loved, which is a big part of being a professor. Frankly, it's because of being in that program that I managed to get into a doctoral program at Cornell University, actually. And that served me very well. And so, but there are not a lot of these programs. And so my own personal experience, I've been trying to drive this initiative, and we're starting doing the groundwork on this now, doing pre-docs, which introduces students, minority students early on, women, to research, because in order to get into good PhD programs, you need to demonstrate that you know a little bit about research. And once we can get more people into those programs, that then primes the pump for more faculty. And so trying to focus on that early, I think, is a great way to start priming that pump. And even if we don't get people into being faculty members, a PhD for underrepresented minorities opens up all kinds of doors. So I think that that is one of the things that I'm really proud that we are driving towards. The next thing I'm going to talk about that was on my list is culture, community, and support. It's all well and good to have people come into the university, come into the business school, and our numbers go up. But if they don't feel included, if they don't feel that they belong, that's not so beneficial, right? They'll leave, they'll be dissatisfied. So we're trying our best to make people feel more included, be mindful of people being included, and not just saying, okay, you're here, you're on your own, but understanding that, there are all types of barriers that have been systemically put in place, and trying to identify those and removing those. And so following, say, if we're talking about students, because like I said, our focus is on all of our constituents, faculty, staff, and students. So if we get students in, we've been increasing numbers of first-generation students, low-income students, but making sure that when we get our students there, we follow them through that life cycle. This pandemic has definitely demonstrated that there are all types of inequities in terms of economics. And we need to recognize that and help our students so they can get the most of being at an institution like Cornell. Next thing I'm going to talk about quickly, because I'm looking at the time, curriculum and classroom. I think it's important to engage our students, all of our students, into topics about race and racism in our curriculum. The more we talk about these things, I think the better it is. And business, people seem to think, they'll talk about it in the humanities and Africana studies. Business education is a great place to also talk about these things. Redlining, there's, when it comes to management, how leadership, we definitely can address these issues. And I've been focused on my colleagues. We now have most of business school, we do a lot of cases in classrooms. I just sent all of my colleagues, we found a database which has cases with minority protagonists, right? So this can generate conversations in the classroom, which is really important because these nuances are really important to talk about, to engage in, and to understand. Next, research and external impact. Cornell, like many of our sister institutions, we are based on research. This is how we present ourselves as focus primarily on research and engaging with our outside partners through our research, as well as the people, our constituents within the university. And having more research in this area, in business and beyond, focusing on inequities, focusing on interventions that may have unintended consequences. All of this is really important and a key focus of what we're doing now. And also measurement and accountability. I think one of the primary ways to not only see where we're at and where we're going, you have to have measurement, but it also keeps you honest. It also keeps the focus on these initiatives. You can imagine there are all types of things pulling resources, and I don't only mean financial resources, time, energy, reopening because of COVID. All of these things can pull people's energies, but by having a focus on measurement, accountability, and data, it keeps our focus on these really important issues. I believe that that's my time. So I will turn it over to Ben. Let me escape and stop sharing. There we go.
Great, thank you, Professor Duguid. So good morning, and I guess for you all it's afternoon, but it's certainly an honor for me to be here. And I know I only have a few minutes, so I'll be relatively succinct, which is not my specialty, and really appreciate the grounding, Dr. Duguid, that you provided, and hopefully I can build upon. I'm going to start a little bit with my own background, in part because as I was reflecting on kind of what I might speak to this morning, I reflected on the importance of story and who and how story gets told and how story can impact and influence work and how stories build movements. And I see myself in my role as a storyteller and a story cultivator. So I was actually born in Tompkins County. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, so I'm now 3,000 miles away, but my parents, a white Jewish mother from the Bronx, and my Black father, whose family came to Syracuse from Alabama, and who I hope are on the YouTube link today. So I'll shout out to Mom and Dad. But they really reflect not just my own identity, right, and the exploration of that and the relationship between these two very different racial and cultural backgrounds and experiences, but also the ways that I've approached the work. And really a key part of what I'd like to leave you all with today, that understanding the relationships, right, between our practices, our policies, approaches, and of course the outcomes that we see in our communities, particularly racialized outcomes, is necessary for the transformation of government and for addressing the pervasive and persistent disparities that we see across our communities. And I'm going to use my time, at least in part, to tell the story of Multnomah County's journey towards equity work, which is also connected to my own. So I started at Multnomah County Health Department. My first title was Community Connector. And at that time, and this is the early 2000s, environmental health was really working through a community process where we had looked at the relationship between race and income and environmental hazard and exposure, and using, and in those days we didn't have kind of heat maps and Tableau software and things like that could overlay. We had the old overhead projectors, right, where you'd lay these things on top of each other, and we recognized very specific geographic areas where the cumulative impacts were being felt. That folks like myself that had gone into community working specifically with low-income housing folks to identify and prioritize issues. And not surprisingly, what we saw in those communities was the incredible impact of things like mold and lead exposure and a general sense and experience of being ignored, right? Feeling powerless when trying to advocate for landlords or getting trash removed from the neighborhood. And those compounding impacts were really damaging. But we also saw very particularly many families who had both adults and children in the homes with asthma. And that's probably not surprising, especially for folks who, have lived in or work with low-income populations. And I tell that short snippet of what is really a broader and much longer story for a couple of reasons. One, that we knew that if we wanted to address asthma morbidity and especially emergency utilization because of asthma attacks, literally, children, I remember going into homes, working with families and, talking to mothers who, children's lips are blue in the middle of the night. And, if you can imagine the stress and trauma that creates. But if we wanted to address that outcome, we had to address the broader social determinants and root causes, right? The experience of racism, discrimination, poverty, lack of power in order to address the problem, right? This was the root of our equity work. And in fact, when we started this work, we talked about what is now the Healthy Homes program as a real model to say, if we want to address asthma morbidity, we actually had to focus on housing policy and landlord rules and tenant protections. And so it started with that recognition that in order to address racial disparities, we needed to address root causes. And what that recognition has led to, initially with the formation in the health department, like many jurisdictions around the country, a lot of this work starts in public health. As I often say, I'm still recovering from public health, decades later, that this was formed in the health department under what was then the Health Equity Initiative. And then more than a decade of work later, that's focused on some key areas in local government that I'll end up closing with. So that work, right, demanded that we shift our practice, and I know Dr. Duguid kind of talked about some of these concepts as well. Demanded we shift our practice. We developed our seminal document, the Equity and Empowerment Lens, Racial Justice Focus, that really pushed us as an organization to ask key and critical questions about who is impacted and how, and in what ways we're engaging most impacted communities to drive solutions. You know, I kind of came up as an environmental justice organizer when we used to say communities that speak for themselves best protect themselves. Right. So when we talk about meaningful involvement, it means that communities are able to influence and impact decisions that affect their lives, drive solutions in community that will benefit them. And then, of course, you know, two other areas: how are we distributing resources, particularly looking at geographic distribution, but understanding the role and concept of place, right, and focusing on place very specifically as a key determinant and space within our lives that has so many distinct, you know, personal, cultural, and community meaning. And then, of course, lastly, our tool talks about how are we thinking about building and sharing power, building capacity in communities, as I've talked about, but also as government, how do we, both inside our walls and outside, share power with those who are most negatively affected by decisions that we make. And also it also meant that we needed to shift our approaches. And we've used frames like, you know, Professor John Powell's targeted universalism, which as its simplest form is the idea that we set universal goals, right? All of our communities can reach their full potential, but also recognize the ways that communities are differently situated. And as Professor Powell would say, in relationship to the social fabric. If we don't understand the way that different communities are intersecting with our social fabric, we actually cannot develop targeted solutions that will work for them based on those unique needs. And developing shared language and vision for what we call, as Ken mentioned earlier, inclusively leading with race, which acknowledges both that race and other forms of marginalized identities compound and interact to create oppression across many communities, and quite frankly, that we've been leading with race from the founding of this country, but it has consistently been leading with white folks, right? So when we talk about inclusively leading with race, it's both an expansion of this concept of how we talk about and think about race, but also gets to what was described earlier in that concept of Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. And it meant that we needed to focus on policy, both internally and externally. And for us, that meant internally, I think very similar to what you just heard, that we had to get our own house in order by investing in things like employee resource groups that, you know, really has helped my office drive our first ever workforce equity strategic plan that focuses on shifting organizational culture, right? Creating senses and spaces of belonging, investing in professional development, advancing opportunities for our employees, ensuring that we have strategies for retention and building pipelines for the future workforce. And externally, and this is obviously a broad conversation, but looking at policies like the work that's happening around reimagining public safety, you know, of course, happening all across the country, including in Tompkins County and Ithaca, to finally reconcile, or as, you know, Reverend Barber or my colleague Glenn Harris have stated, engage in the third reconstruction in this country around race and racism that will finally address the systemic violence against Black and brown bodies. So, of course, each of these areas, right, practice, approach, policy, deserves, you know, hours and hours of conversation and dissection. And of course, each is necessary to account for and redress the role that government has played in creating and perpetuating inequity in communities. And so for today, I think I'll stop there. And hopefully in our Q&A, we can dive a little more deeply. So thank you.
Okay, thank you both, Ben and Michelle. And we want to encourage those of you who are part of the audience to send your questions through the chat function, and so that you can be part of this conversation. So we're going to move now to our question and answer session. I want to start with a question I'll pose to both of you. What have been some of the common challenges, obstacles to efforts to center equity in the workplace?
Professor, you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Ben. I think one of the things that comes to mind first for me I think many of my colleagues want to engage. They think that this is important. These issues are important, and they see themselves, of course, as supporters, but they sometimes find it hard to be real allies, to actually really engage. Either they don't think it's their place, they don't know how to, they're uncomfortable, it's difficult conversations. And so I think a lot of my time is spent, saying, seeing yourself as an ally, but your behavior needs to match that. And one of the things we know about allyship through all the research is, allies, it's not a matter of when you're going to probably say or do something wrong. It's just, it'll happen. But it is that you need to see this as a learning experience, and being able to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Not, I'm sorry if you were too sensitive. No. I'm sorry if I offended, and really trying to engage and being okay with being uncomfortable. Like I said, I think many people, their hearts are in the right place, but being okay with being uncomfortable, because frankly, we can't do all of this work on our own. Research shows that if, say, for example, they put two people, someone who's Black or someone who's white, and as a bystander, and someone did something wrong, said something offensive, when a Black, against another Black person, when a Black person tried to intervene, it wasn't as effective. It was more effective when a white person intervened. So it's more effective to have allies, and it's just fair. We can't always be the ones pushing the boat forward. It's only fair to have help doing this. And so trying to get people, our allies, to engage versus just seeing themselves as allies, but those behaviors that are associated with allyship is important.
We have to normalize discomfort as part of the learning process and part of the equity building process, as Herman Blake, an educator, talked about many years ago. Ben, your response?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. I'm going to start at the personal level. And in particular, I'm going to do this in support of my sister, Deanna, who's coming into this role as a Chief Diversity and Equity Officer. So part of the challenge is the weight and the burden and the expectation that comes onto folks that are coming into this work, that institutions are going to look to this savior who's going to come in and solve all the problems. And that is not just irresponsible, but it's incredibly traumatic and damaging to the individuals that are carrying that weight and that burden, in our physical, mental, and spiritual reality. So I'll say that, and I think for many folks and many institutions, they look around and say, okay, well, you're the Black guy or you're the Latino, so you're going to be our equity person. And I think that's a real danger and risk, and we see it all the time. Understanding what it means to do it, right? And that's a real challenge, right? When we talk about advancing racial equity or advancing equity, what that really means in practice. What does that look like in policy? What does it mean when we're trying to manage a team or convene a community group or whatever that is, right? All of the ways that we interact with the work can be really difficult. Legal barriers, right? We've had years of conversations around this idea that you can't consider race. And, I would argue that our kind of civil rights laws have gone backwards in many ways. And we have found some creative ways to think differently about how do we prioritize racial equity under the constraints. How do we, we can't say, well, okay, we're going to give 10 points because, you're Black on a job interview, but we can ask specific type of questions that allow people to talk about their lived experience as a skill and an attribute and a value add that can be scored appropriately. So how do we get around that? But it is a barrier and a challenge. And then the last thing I'd say is, just the idea of resistance, both belief that, both believing like, this is work that we've already solved. We had a Black president, all that kind of stuff, but also like folks that have a very real sense that they're going to lose something, that they have to give up something in order for us to have a more just society. And I think we need to be able to address that. I said that was the last thing, but I'll say one more thing. I think one of the challenges that we've had, particularly working with frontline community, is that for many folks, power has come from sharing their scars, right? Power has come from talking about their trauma and pain. And it's often very difficult then to move folks into, okay, we hear you, you're with us, you're at the table of decisions, and not being able to move to solution, right? So we have to build our ability to have a more radical and collective reimagination together. And that can be a real difficult thing to move across an organization.
Oh, go ahead, Michelle. Were you going to say something?
No, I actually have to jump off the call, but this was a true pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely.
And allowing me to share the virtual stage with you. It was truly a highlight.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to some further collaboration with you.
Absolutely. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. You too. And again, for those of you who have specific questions for Dr. Duguid, please provide those through the chat function that's available to you. Ben, one of the things I'd like to ask you is, what is essential to securing buy-in from co-workers on the matter of centering racial and other types of equity?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's still a work in progress, but I'll try to reflect a little bit on what I've kind of spoken to already, and then some of the other ways that I think we can continue to do so. So some of the ways that we've gotten buy-in is kind of that, what we might call the stick approach, right? And some of the ways that in Multnomah County we've looked to do that is by, we're working on a process around leadership expectations, right? That we're actually setting an expectation that you are practicing equity in the day-to-day operations of the organization. We have developed competencies as we evaluate our employees that include things like acting in a racially just manner or promoting equity. And while we're still working to define that really clearly, being able to set clear expectations that are unequivocal, that says, if you are going to lead in this organization, manage in this organization, participate in the transformational work of Multnomah County, that we are both going to invest in you, right, to be able to build and lift up those skill sets, but you have to get there, right? And I think that's kind of one piece. The other piece that I spoke to a little bit earlier, I think, is that we have to be really sophisticated at creating narrative and shared language and understanding of what do we mean when we're talking about racial equity or talking about equity in a broader sense. And so, one of the things, and I know we talked about this, I think in the past, targeted universalism, which, I would offer everyone on this call kind of Google searches after this and watches and listens to John Powell talk about it, really offers us an opportunity to bring people in because we are reframing it. And I imagine people have seen that old image, equity versus equality. I don't know if it's gone to the East Coast, but I think it's around, right? We have the people looking over the fence and there's 3 boxes and there's a tall person, shorter person, and the shortest person. And, what I think John's work has really offered us is that there's not one solution to this, right? That our opportunity and our commitment, I have a colleague in that I work with who says, our primary obligation is to get the best value for the taxpayer and the best outcome for the client. And that's an important piece of government, right? And what it offers in Targeted Universal is to say, we want all of our communities to thrive, right? If we're looking at high school graduation, we want every child to graduate high school. Now, our data tells us, and what we intimately need to understand about our communities is that the barriers for a young Black boy and an immigrant Latino, may look very different. Person with a disability or developmental challenges or someone who's houseless, like they're going to need different strategies, but the goal is that everyone is thriving. And so we've been really trying to talk about that within our own institution to be like, we want to provide opportunity for everyone in our organization, but our employee survey shows that people of color, LGBTQ folks, people with disability, older employees, et cetera, do not feel like their identity is valued in our organization. And so when we talk about, we want everyone to feel a sense of belonging by understanding more intimately, what is it that prevents that for these different populations? I think we can do a lot, but it allows everyone to see themselves in the work. And I think, as Dr. Duguid said, right, is also really doing work around, what does it mean to be an ally, a co-conspirator, comrade, whatever the language is, right? There's lots of narrative around that. But making sure that everybody knows, and I would say this on this call too, right, that every single day, each and every one of us has the opportunity, has the obligation, and has the skills to make someone feel more welcome than they might have the day before. There is no excuse for not being more deeply connected with each other, for not being more curious and interested, engaged with community. You have the world at your fingertips in terms of information. There is brilliance all over who are writing and educating and giving perspective. So there's a lot of ways I think that we can continually engage folks in this work, in this movement, and in the kind of journey towards justice and equity in this country.
Okay, great. I'd like to ask you to drill down a little bit more in terms of just what you talked about in terms of the notion of story. We've had scholars from, Africana studies, as well as womanist theologians and others who've talked about the importance of personal narrative. How have you employed or created space for people to share their stories across the various identities and divides to build this, to build equity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a long answer probably, but I'll try to be relatively succinct. One, I think, as I started with today, I think it's absolutely critical for those of us that are kind of hierarchical leaders, I'll use that term intentionally, that we are telling our story, that we are sharing our personal narrative, that we are being vulnerable as leaders, right? That gives other people the permission to do the same. I'll use a couple examples in our organization where story has been impacted. And I referenced, the Workforce Equity Strategic Plan. What I didn't talk about is in 2017, and you can go back and look at the board meeting of Multnomah County in September of 2017. We had a scheduled briefing for the board around a workforce equity kind of vision, that we wanted to kick off. Right before that, a key Black woman in our organization, a leader in community and in our institution, had been kind of pushed out of the organization. Right? Won't go into details about all the complexities of that.
Sure.
But community showed up, and employees showed up at a public board meeting. Right? Employees. Hundreds of employees showed up and they told their stories. They said, this is the racism that I experience in this organization. This is the discrimination that I feel every day. These are the microaggressions that are happening all the time, right? And the power of that was twofold. One, I think it was cathartic for people to be able to publicly state their experience and the narrative, to challenge our organization and institution. The power of that was really critical. But it also meant that for an office like ours, it was leverage to be able to say, we've heard it, and people are ready to do the work, and they're ready to hold us accountable. So I think, that's not something we've necessarily cultivated. That is something that people commanded and demanded, right? They owned and took that space. And then I think in the other side of the equation, right, we have, whether it's in training environments, Right now, particularly as folks are working remote, our employee resource groups are supporting what they call virtual support circles that happen once a week, where people are talking about their experiences, their stories, and what they're struggling with, and they're finding resource and connection and affirmation and empathy with folks that share those experiences. We have equity managers in all of our departments that are leading things like healing sessions, where people's stories then can get turned into solutions and healing and pathways towards health. And we've really invested in places that really are, just facilitated spaces that is just here to listen, right? Where folks are able to kind of come together. But I think, when we're thinking about what has transformed government, right? I think we talked about George Floyd, right? And, George Floyd's story and, Black Lives Matter. And that story is being told by Black people in a way that doesn't allow, you see it, but it doesn't allow the media to say, well, let's look at all the faults of George Floyd, right? We will forever know 8 minutes and 46 seconds. We will forever know what that means. That will be a catalyst forever as part of the story for our moment in time, our opportunity in time to really radically try to redress what has occurred in this country. And so, I think story and narrative and who gets to own that is so important, because I think we're seeing it in real time, that when the people that experience the realities are telling and shaping the story and the policies and approaches and practices that come from that, that the movements are more powerful and change can be more rapid.
Great, thank you. There's a question that's come to us. Do you have any suggestions for another term beside buy-in? That always sounds like we're trying to rope people into something. Thank you. So,
Yeah.
What's your response?
Well, I don't know if I have a good one. I mean, I would put that back on someone to come back with it, and there's smarter people than I that would. I mean, we do talk about, I find myself using that language, but more so, I think I often talk about, as hopefully I did in many ways today, talk about being part of a movement. Right. It's, you're not purchasing something, right? Which, has lots of capitalism overlays that could be harmful as well. But really, we're asking you to join. We're asking you to be a part of. We're asking you to play a role. We're asking you to help us build. And I don't know a good phrase for that, but I think when we talk about this work, and I know Governing Alliance for Racial Equity is a critical place where we've always kind of thought about it. We're building a movement of government jurisdictions, right? We're not asking for buy-in necessarily, although in some ways they literally are asking for buy-in, right? You're investing in the model. But really we're asking to join a movement, to join in a radical reimagination of what is possible, a challenge to our collective learning about the history of this country. And the role that government has played in perpetuating inequality. So, I love that question. If it was asked to me yesterday, I would have came with a better answer, but off the top of my head, I don't have one. But I think if we can continue to talk about, how are we bringing people in, like joining in, from a place of belonging, connection and relationship and love, then I think, we're not asking somebody to purchase. But I will say, as a last thing, and then I'll shut up, I'm rambling a little bit, but what part of what buy-in is asking is an investment of your time, of your energy, of your passion, of your love. And so in some ways that term can be really meaningful. And I think, being creative about, language that will speak to the masses, speak to those that don't see themselves as a part of it is really important.
I think you hit on something there in the response. I mean, you talked about joining and being a part of, and it seems to be a connection between joining and the emphasis in your county on belonging, for example, and even in terms of what's in part of Michelle's title, for instance, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Yeah. And we know, for example, in higher education, belonging has become an important concept in terms of, say, undergraduate student development. I mean, you can even extend it to graduate students.
Yeah.
But it also in workplaces like ours in county government, that seems to me to be an important link there.
Yeah, and it's so intimately human, right? I mean, we talk about our frame of safety, trust, and belonging, as you referenced earlier, right? Like, I know everybody who's listening in today knows what it feels like to feel safe or unsafe. You know what it feels like to hold trust and to lose trust.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, when you have felt like you belonged and when you were the other. And so I think these concepts, which I really love, that watching belonging become such a powerful frame across the country. Deeply rooted in lots of community. It's so human, right? We can feel it. We know it when it's there, and we know when it's not. And I think for a lot of this work, that is so important. Like, what can you feel, right? And I know in government, we often don't talk, I try to intentionally use the language of love, Dr. Cornell West, right? I think he says, I always screw up his comment, but right, social justice is what love looks like in public.
No, that's exactly what he said. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right. I'm always like, my paraphrasing and my quoting is, pushing the boundaries of my memory sometimes. But we often don't talk about love, and I would say if you go in workforce equity strategic plan, you'll see the image of safety, trust, and belonging, and in the middle of it is a heart, like in a public document, right? We put the heart and love at the center, right? That it's love for ourselves, it's love for our community, right? It's love for our, the generations that come behind us. And it's a powerful thing that I think, there's a couple things in our equity empowerment lens that, you don't see in a lot of other jurisdictions. One is, thinking about this concept of love, but we also talk about spirituality. That is also deeply human. I'm not talking about necessarily faith in terms of religious faith, but what gives us, the root of spear, right? To give breath, right? What gives us breath? What gives us meaning? What gives us value? And when we talk about safety, trust, and belonging, that intersection and connection to feeling valued, to feeling like you're important, you have something to add. And maybe this gets back to that question around buy-in. Like, buy-in as a frame is one thing, right? But what we're really trying to do is bring spirit in, right? That buy-in is about, you have a role, you have value, you have something to contribute to this work.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's really, I mean, what your comments too also indicate, how do we take into consideration all that enables us to be fully human?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's such a beautiful way to frame it, right? And I think, we've gotten away from some of that kind of language, right? But if we stay in the kind of bureaucratic language, right? And I speak that language, right? I've been indoctrinated. But if we consistently stay in the language of the bureaucracy and not the language of community and human beings and people, I think we're missing something, right? And so I love what you're saying, right? It's like, what does it mean to be human? Let's talk and start there, and then think about how do we make that experience and those feelings and that kind of emotive connection to that reality. How do we bring that into our organizations on a day-to-day basis?
Could you discuss the role of community engagement in equity work, especially as it relates to the delivery of services?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, I think philosophically and, within our kind of frameworks and tools, we've called out, right? I mentioned this earlier, right? We talk about not just understanding, looking at data and knowing who's impacted, but then how are we meaningfully involving, right? And meaningful involvement means the ability to influence decision, right? Not, I'm going to survey you and then, maybe use your data or not. People talk about a seat at the table, or what's the old expression? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I'm like, how do we get to co-creation of the menu, right? Because it's one thing even to be at the table, but who's setting that menu, who's leading the conversation, right? So, we can carry that metaphor, pretty deep. But I think it's integral and necessary. And if we are not doing that, part of what John Powell's targeted universalism demands, right, is an intimate understanding of community experience. And some of that you get because you have folks who work in our institutions and work in community-based organizations and academia that grew up in those spaces and places, right, that share those experiences and have close proximity to it. But when we're talking about our clients, if you will, we have to do a much better job. I don't think it's possible to develop solutions that work for community if community is not helping drive those solutions. I do not think philosophically it's an appropriate way to govern, nor do I think it's an efficacious way to ensure that our communities are getting the services designed with and for them, right? So really quickly, I'll say, we developed some guidance a few years back that we're still working to revise that really is around culturally specific services. And part of it was an attempt for years. Community was saying, part of it was a funding mechanism, right? Community-based organizations, particularly rooted in communities of color, were saying, you're not investing in us in the ways that are necessary. But we developed definitions around culturally specific services that really describe this goes back to that legal barrier, right? We're not saying you're going to get this contract because your executive director is a person of color and your board is a person of color. We're not going to count demographics and allocate resources. What we did say, though, is that we will fund organizations and we will define and prioritize organizations that are rooted in community, were formed with community, that design their programs with and for, that have clients that are influencing and informing and part of evaluation and assessment that does quality improvement in that population, and that purpose and root of these organizations was to serve those communities. And so I think there's a lot of ways to kind of get there, but I think the essence of your question is spot on. I don't think that we are actually doing equity work if we're not engaging those who are most impacted by the work that we do.
And two, talk to, in terms of the question of community, but also in terms of in working in county government, about the kind of pick up on what Michelle said about allyship. How do you, in terms of their role in helping to advance equity?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. One, that kind of that personal piece I talked about, right? Like if the burden of change is always going to be solely owned by those that are most negative impacted within structures that's not where the power lives, like that's irreconcilable, and creates lots of pain and distrust. I'll also say, and probably not too dissimilarly to upstate New York. Portland, Oregon, and you can Google this, between us and Salt Lake City, we're like the whitest major metropolitan city in the United States. So even on our best days, right, we're still somewhere in the range of 65% white employees, right? So the majority, and probably for the next at least decade, the majority of our employees will be white. Will be straight, cisgender, right? So, part of allyship, and I love the way that, Professor Duguid talked about it, in an organization like ours, and I would suggest an organization like Tompkins County, or City of Ithaca, or any number of places around this country, we actually can't do transformation if we don't have folks that are participating actively and that understand their role and are engaging intentionally in their own learning and growth. We have to support that. So one of the things that we are piloting in our office, we have what's called Whiteness at Work, and it's a cohort of white employees who are coming together, supported by some facilitation and coaching out of our office, that come together with shared learning, a place where they can go to and say, I'm really struggling with this concept. Can I talk to you about it? Or I'm really trying to figure out what it would look like to interrupt in this way or to shift my management style in this way. And so we're just on that beginning part of a really intentional investment of saying, actually, if we want to do transformation, there is investment in resources for our employees of color and other marginalized folks. And we have to look at the power, structure of dominant culture and start to transform and deeply engage and invest in and be in relationship with folks who we need, right, to be able to do some of that work. That's early on in the process, and it's actually part of my own growth as a leader, right? I think a few years ago, if you were asking me, should we build models and cohorts of white folks that are, we're going to invest in, I'd be like, not with our limited resources, we should be investing over here and over here and over here. But I think more and more I've realized that importance of building a culture of folks who are joining in, right? Folks who see themselves as part of this in meaningful ways.
Mm-hmm. What would you consider one of your most important victories in centering equity?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think I'd probably referenced them. I think I would, the first ever workforce equity strategic plan, I think was a really powerful gift to this organization. Not, the strategies themselves, are not, monumental. I mean, you could, it's do better, more diverse applicant pools and, have diverse interview panels and invest in professional development and make sure people have peer supports and mentors. So the ideas within it are not monumental, but the fact that it was driven by frontline employees, led by employee resource groups, the fact that it names inclusively leading with race and targeted universalism and safety, trust, and belonging all in one place, I think is really powerful and started to shift the expectation of how we make decisions and how we develop vision as an organization. And then I would, probably also speak to our equity and empowerment lens. And, it was early on in my kind of equity specific kind of discipline career where we worked on that. And my good friend and colleague Sonali Balaji was a lead author, and she brought her brilliance and talked to folks all over the country and even internationally to really parse out some of the resources. But I would suggest that, selfishly, it's the strongest tool in the country for some of the things that I mentioned earlier. But, it asks about trauma, right? I don't know that you'll see in any other tool in the country, how are people re-traumatized by the work that we're trying to do as government, or how might this trauma, bring trauma to populations. It asks about physical, spiritual, and emotional context, right? That if we don't understand the relationship that people have, whether it's with police, I'll use that example, right? There's a deep spiritual connection with place. So as we've watched communities be gentrified, right, that loss, that disconnection is both traumatic, but it's spiritually draining. It's emotionally and mentally draining. So I think there's things like that I'm just really proud of. And then the last thing I would probably say, and I won't take credit for this necessarily as an individual, but watching the shift in leadership. I was on a call yesterday. It was kind of a countywide, what we call in the frame, where we have kind of leaders that kind of talk about issues and reflect. And to hear our leadership, both leaders of color and white leaders in this organization talk about race and racism, talk about equity in ways that are profound and are honest and vulnerable was so moving. And that is, something I'm really proud of, that Multnomah County over the years has really built, at least at that level, this organization, some real commitment. And you could see that folks have actively reflected on their role as leaders in this movement. And I think that's a really powerful thing.
Great. Well, I really appreciate from you, Ben, as well as from Michelle, the holistic approach that you've taken to your equity work, in the ways in which you sought to be as inclusive as possible. And always building on inclusive. This inclusion is always a work in progress. We never reach an arrival point on this. And I think that you and Michelle have given us a great deal to think about and to consider and to implement in our practices, in particular for us in Tompkins County, as we seek to center an equity lens at the heart of our work in this county. So I'm really grateful that you and Michelle were able to join us, and thank you for the wonderful presentations you provided. Thanks to our audience for questions, and to all of you who tuned in today for our event. Next month in December, our virtual Brown Bag Lunch event will focus on confronting a winter of discontent. We will be talking about resources that are available to those who struggle during the holiday season with loneliness and depression, and especially so in an environment of social distancing during a pandemic. We ask you to join us as we explore this important topic, and we hope to see you next month. Again, thank you for joining us today. Okay, I don't know whether we are live or not, but
Looks like it says live on the top, but
it does.
I
Okay.
think Dominic will probably cut folks out at some point. But
Okay, well, let me contact him.